Hello, today we are interviewing Gary Richards, who is a longtime board member of Adair Living History. My name is Dave Dixon. I will be conducting the interview, and I am just have just recently moved to Oregon from the East Coast, and I have also become a board member of Adair Living History. So Gary, let's start today by, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, I was born here in Corvallis in May of 1941, and then Japan hit Pearl Harbor in December, so I've been around for a lot of history. Of all my schooling, I don't remember anything from any history class that I ever took, except one right here on History of Western Civilization. Here's a little German guy that was teaching this class, and my mom found out I was going to be in his class, and she says, "Oh, well, I took his class too when I was going up there," and he told us a joke, and she told me what it was, and I went to his class and he told the same joke, which just proves that history does not change. And the joke was, why do they call it the Dark Ages? Because there are so many nights. And that was it. And of course, all the little college girls in the front row up there, they all chittered how funny that he was, you know, but that's the way they get their grades, I guess.
Yeah. Where have you lived in this area?
Okay, I was born south of Corvallis by Wagner's Butte. I lived there till I was about 6 years old. My dad broke his back in a farming accident, and then we moved up to Suver Junction, which is on kind of the northeastern corner of Camp Adair. We got there in about 1947, and one of my first memories of Camp Adair was one morning there was all this noise going on outside on 99, and we looked out and there was a building from Camp Adair being hauled up 99 and turned up the area road to be used as somebody's house or a building somewhere. Back in those days, because of the war effort, there was a shortage of a lot of things, including building materials. And so when they tore down Camp Adair, that was one of the big things there. They hired a bunch of kids to pull nails out of boards and that, but they had several different crews in there that tore down. There was 1,800 buildings down there. And so they were tearing the things down, and the kids were pulling the nails and they were stacking up. It was just turned into a great big huge lumber yard. And everybody around there, if they were trying to get material for something, that was the cheapest place to go and probably the most material of any of them. Not only lumber, but there was toilets and sinks and light fixtures. Anything that was in those Camp Adair buildings, people were snapping them up because that was the cheapest and the closest place to get anything, and most available. One of the things that was a really hot commodity were the chapels. A pause there for a moment. There's only one reason why we had chapels at Camp Adair or at any other camp. During the war effort, they wanted to get as many people trained as fast as they could and get them sent overseas, so they made all these temporary camps. Before, all the permanent military positions were forts, and they still are.
Right.
But they made all these temporary camps, and they were designed to be put up quickly, train the people, and then just abandoned and torn down. So they weren't going to waste money on building chapels. Fortunately, we had a wonderful First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah, I'm going to check with my mind here. Anyway, she says if those guys are good enough to die for us, they're good enough to have chapels. So they made a revised edition of the, what do they call them now? Regimental Cavalry Chapel, I think they called them. It was clear back from World War I. And I think the main difference was the trusses and that they used inside for the roof. On the World War II ones, they'd made glue-lam curved trusses, which that's the hallmark that I always look for when I'm looking for one of these chapels. And of the 11 chapels that Camp Adair had, I've located 10 of them, and that's kind of my claim to fame. I'm an uneducated old redneck. I spent 5 terms here at Oregon State back when it was college, And the only thing I remember is that joke from that one history class. So I ended up by stumbling into finding some of these buildings and that. I stumbled into what I like to consider and pat myself on the back as the world's leading expert on one very, very small slice of history, and that's Camp Adair buildings and their chapels. Mm-hmm. So that's my one claim to fame, and I started, well, I was geocaching. I was starting to put some of these things on to the internet for other geocachers to find these different points of interest down at the Camp Adair. The site I used had a very limited amount of space that I could use on there without having to pay for it.
Right.
So one of these days as I was going along there, I found out about a new little group starting up there at Adair Village that was going to save the history of Camp Adair. And so I went down there and joined them because they were going to go ahead and they were going to be able to put my stuff out there that I wouldn't have to pay for, So mm-hmm. I had my own little motivation there for joining up with Adair Living History, and I've been with it ever since.
What was your occupation?
When I first got married, I set chokers there for a couple of weeks, and then I went into cabinet making and carpentry and construction work.
What is the history of your family? Because I know that your family has lived in other places besides where you live now in the northern part of
well, my family,
where the camp was.
Like I say, my family started off there south of Corvallis, and then they moved up there to Suver. After I got married, I moved to Valsets, and I was up there for 18 years. Mm-hmm. And then I moved back down to the same place again.
Well, didn't your grandfather have a farm on Kiger Island?
Yes, he did.
I know that your mom had a real interest in the history of this area, and I've seen a couple of the books that were published by Polk County regarding Camp Adair in World War II, and I'm just wondering a little bit about how much her interest, as well as her efforts to protect that history, influenced you.
Well, I know she told me that when they were living south of Corvallis, out there by Wagner's Butte, that she was one of these airplane spotters. Mm-hmm. Supposed to identify. I never saw anything out there. But after we moved up there to Suver, they got the little country store up there. Things, as you go along there, and things got more modernized, more people didn't go so much to the little country store anymore. They'd run into Safeway or something like that, because of better prices, better variety. So her country store, she's just started, especially when Dad died and all that, and it was just her, she started getting less and less in the store and filling up the shelves with things that she was taking off of people's pickups on the way to the dump. There'd be something there. Oh, I've got a little poor man's museum going in here. Can I have that? So there's a lot of stuff that she accumulated up there, and some of the stuff that she accumulated are now in the Independence Museum or in the Polk County Museum. Mm-hmm. And some of the other stuff that she accumulated was the school bell from the Suver schoolhouse and the old original post office boxes from the Suver post office. So there's some good stuff and some other, like I say, poor man museum type things that as we go along there, the modern kids nowadays, they don't know what this older stuff is there. They'll look at a tool or something like that. I worked construction and all that all my life, so I know all these tools. These modern kids, they don't know anything. Everything nowadays has got to be computer operated for them to understand, Mm-hmm. So we need to save the artifacts from our past, and we need to save some of the skills from our past too. I've got a little hand-powered forge, and as a kid growing up there, the neighboring farms down there from the store, they had forge down there. And so that was kind of the fun thing we do. I'd go down to the neighbors down there and would grab a piece of metal out of the scrap pile and heat it up and beat it on the anvil and shape things around. As a matter of fact, one thing I could remember that they'd taken like a 2x4 and run it over a table saw and made a slot in the bottom. Then they put in a piece of metal in there for a blade. They made their own ice skates for when the pond froze over down there. Back in those days, we had to make our own entertainment and stuff, you know. And I feel sorry for the kids nowadays. Everything's all on a computer, or you go to a theater or something like that, and you pay to sit there and watch somebody else do something. They don't have the hands-on stuff that we had. And that's where I think this saving our history is important. These kids don't know what the heck they're missing, and one of these days, hopefully, they'll see one of our exhibits and, hey, that looks interesting. I want to try something like that, you know. So I think we're on a mission. Make it sound real important, anyway.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about Camp Adair, and let me begin by defining Camp Adair. Shortly after World War II started, after the United States got involved, the government set up a camp which is just north of Corvallis. There's actually Adair Village is there today, and this camp was significantly large. It was almost 90 square miles. It went from what is currently Adair Village all the way to Monmouth, and then it was, 8 to 10 miles wide, depending upon where you were located.
Went clear over to the Dallas-Kings Valley Highway and over to the Willamette River in some spots. In fact, there was, I think, a couple hundred acres across the Willamette.
Yeah, and it was used for engineers to practice river landings, crossing rivers, things like that. There were 4 divisions that trained in Camp Adair over the course of the war, 2 at a time. Infantry division during World War II was approximately 15,000 men. So you had approximately 60,000 men were trained there, but the number is significantly higher because you had people that were constantly being transferred in and transferred out. Also, it was the second largest city in Oregon at that time. That's how big this encampment was. So, Gary, you lived just north of, or at the northern section of it for many, many years, but when and why did you become interested in Camp Adair?
I can't remember which year it was, but one year my wife for Christmas got me a GPS that goes in your car. And so I got on my computer and doing a little research on it, and I found out that there is a wonderful game you can play with GPSs called geocaching. And as long as your GPS has a provision where you can enter coordinates into it, you can play the game. So okay, my car deal had that. So I went on there and I found out that there were geocaches down at E.E. Wilson Game Management, which was the old original main part of the post where all the barracks and everything were. So I went down there and I started searching things out. And one of the first things I found was a geocache called Stairway to Heaven. And I followed the coordinates and I got there. And here's this big cement swimming pool there. Here's the most sloping floor going down there, for the bottom of the pool, and there's steps coming up out of the pool on both sides and all that. Boy, these guys got it made, So I checked that one off on my list. And I got checking later, I don't remember if it was Polk County or Benton County Museum, but one of them had a map of the layout of the camp. And I found out that that's a theater. And it had never dawned on me, when you walk into a theater, you go down into the ground. And as you go towards the stage and the screen. And so when you take the building away, it looks like a great big swimming pool, and that's what it was. And that map told me that there was 5 of those theaters there. And so I found the rest of those. And as I was going about this, I discovered there were other foundations that had distinctive footprints too. The chapels being one of them. And John Baker wrote the book on Camp Adair, and he said in there that they had 11 chapels. And I got to talking there with John, and he gave me some hints there. He said that there was one in Lincoln City, and he thought Dallas and maybe Molalla. Well, I never found one in Molalla, but I found the one in Dallas. I've been going by it all the time when I was working. And so I found that, and so I saw what they looked like on the inside. And so, okay, now I'm going to see if I can find them. So I did a lot of searching on the internet and tracing these things down. And I ended up finding 10 out of the 11. And the reason I found that many was that John Bennett, they're from the Gazette-Times and the Democrat-Herald, he got interested and wrote an article in there talking about my search. And some lady in Albany, she said, I know where there's one of them. She said, it's down here in Crescent City, California. Okay, that's nice. We've got a World War II chapel, but sure wouldn't be from Camp Adair. Camp White was much closer. But she said, no, they got paperwork down there saying it came from Camp Adair. And so she got me connected with the wife of the priest. It was an Episcopal church. And she happened to run an advertising business. And she took her photographer, and they went out there and they took all these wonderful photos of that chapel, inside and out. Now, one thing about the chapels, when they were sold, they had to be used as a church or as a war memorial. You couldn't use them for private purposes. And it cost just under $1,000 a piece for these congregations. And they had to come out, tear it down themselves, and then transport it and rebuild it. Okay, I didn't know it at the time when I was doing all this searching around. I was working for a contractor, John Pfeiffer, over in Silverton. And he was the one that moved the Silverton Chapel over to where it is. It's St. Paul's Catholic. And when I would go back and forth to work, I was going by that one all the time too. And it was kind of like the one there in Corvallis. They were very sneaky. When they rebuilt the things, they went ahead and fancied it up. They put bricks on the outside for a facade, I guess you'd call it, and kind of hid it that way. And some of them, as they rebuilt them, they changed them. In Sweet Home, they made it into an L shape, and they left out a couple of those wonderful glulam trusses. I'd love to know where those glulam trusses went to. Would have loved to have them right now to put it out there in Adair Village as an archway to come into where our interpretive center is. But it's just been a wonderful experience tracking these down. And I still would love to find that 11th chapel before I die. So hopefully people that watch this think about it, and I hope it develops an interest for somebody else and they keep on this. Now, I've been very fortunate. Here I am, 82 years old, and I'm on the way out. My lungs are bad. I'm going out. But evidently, I take it that God kind of approved of this project of mine because he sent me a professional historian. Dave, he didn't say it, but he was high school history teacher back there in New York. And fortune has it that his son moved out here and he got himself a house right next to Adair. And so, being a good grandpa and all that, and wanted to see the grandkids and spoil them, he moved out here too and found out about us. So he's volunteered to take over my position. So what I started off here as a redneck and kind of stumbling and bumbling my way along, I'm entrusting to Dave, and he's going to find more and put the polish on it, make it professional looking. And so thank you, Dave.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
Well, I find it absolutely fascinating that first of all, the military built those chapels, then they sold them, and the fact that you found 10 of the 11 is just insane. I mean, I find it really fascinating. Which brings me kind of back to Camp Adair. So after the military left, all of the buildings were sold off as surplus, including the chapels. And then it ended up, there were a number of different phases there where there's OSU housing. There were some POWs, German POWs that were held there. And then we moved into the Air Force, actually came in and set up the Air Force Base or station, and they were there. And then after they left in the late 60s, in the early 70s, Camp Adair was established. Can you tell us a little bit about your memories of the transition from it being a military camp to it being the present day camp or Adair Village?
Okay, the POWs, they were there while the Army was still there. and they were there till 45, so it would be about that time there when they got rid of, well, as soon as the war was over, then you had to repatriation,
Right.
sending people back. And that's one thing about America. We had Germans and Italians out there as prisoners of war, and the ones that were good and cooperated, they were used by all the local farmers out there. And there was a lot of good friendships made, and a lot of those people came back after the war because they loved it over here.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, when I was going to grade school in Monmouth, there was a shoemaker in there called Otto, and he was one of those. And he'd come
Wow.
back and he started up a business. There was a lot of stuff there. Enemies became friends and that because of this. Americans, we like to be friendly up to a point.
Yeah.
So that's one of the good things from back in those days. After they were done there with the camp tearing it down, there in the hospital area, they had one of the wonderful benefits of World War II was they started this GI Bill, and where the Vets Village was for Corvallis, Albany, was there part of the old wards for the hospital. In the case of Camp Adair, we did not have a hospital. It was one great big building. There was no big building, period. It was all a bunch of, well, if you look at our interpretive center, they were buildings like that, only longer, but they were single story. And each one of them was a ward, and you look at the old photographs, and you're just row and row and row of those things with these raised wooden sidewalks in between, because Camp Swampy and that, I mean, it rained a lot out here and kept them out of the mud. So they took those wards and divided them, I think, into 3, and made them into like little triplexes there for the married students going to college. And then, I think Cisco, I think they called it. They were in there for a while, and I think down around the Blockhouse area, and that was to do there with some of the Indian tribes. They had a sweat lodge and stuff there, and I don't remember what all happened there with them. And then there had been kind of an ongoing deal there with labor unions training carpenters and laborers out there, and I think they still do some of that to a certain extent. But once the Air Force moved in the 60s, they of course built the big block house and all the cement buildings that are in the hospital area. They tore down almost all the old wooden buildings. There was a few left, and that's where our interpretive center and the model railroad layout, those are 2 left over. I think they were used mainly as kind of storage or warehouses, stuff like that. I'm not sure on that. But they had what was the officers club has become part of Benton County's set up down there, and they have it's up for rent. Like my sister, when she got married, she was married down there, and a lot of others have been. And then Benton County built a real nice county park down there, and they've made a lot of use out of what was originally an Army hospital and then Navy hospital, because after the Army moved out, the war in the South Pacific was still going. And so the Navy took over, and so there were Navy and Marines wounded, brought up there. And then the Air Force came in. Okay, the lower camp down there that was the main Army camp, that was taken over by Oregon Fish and Wildlife, and made a pheasant refuge out of it. And when they started building the Air Force station, they also, and a lot of people don't realize it, but if you go through old camp down there, once you travel east, just past the wildlife viewing area, there's a little parking lot there for going down to the fishing pond, and then right next to that, you see these big concrete columns sticking up there And that was what was the Army Field House, which was their big recreation building. That's where the basketball courts and all that sort of things were.
And that's right on Camp Adair Road.
Right.
On the north side?
Right, going through the old camp. Mm-hmm. And if you look right behind that, you will see a stand of fir trees, a big square stand standing up there above everything else. Now, this is a hint for people out there looking for old things. Anytime you see a stand of trees that's sticking up above everything else, that's something old. And that was where, when they were putting the Air Force Station in the 60s, they started putting in a Beaumark ground-to-air missile site. Beaumark, I think, was about the only Air Force missile. And most of the others there, they've gone there with Army and all that sort of stuff. But then Air Force got them there now too. But that was built, there was people that remember the older jet airplanes. You remember the old Delta Dart, which had the big kind of a triangular wing that swept back there on the thing. That was what the Beaumark missile was like. And it was fired originally by liquid propellant. Okay. And then later on, they used solid on there, because with the solid, you didn't have that fuel and up time before you could fire them off. And the whole reason that they were putting these out here was at that time we were in the Cold War, and our adversary was Russia. And so everything was prepared. They called this DEW lines, distant early warning lines, and they had Adair down there. That was going to be part of it down here. It was kind of the last stand. We were protecting San Francisco. But before that, there was ones up there in Canada. There was ones up there in Alaska and all that. And the whole thing was, if these bombers came over the North Pole from Russia, then the first line of defense, they would do what they could to knock some down, then the second line of defense and the third line of defense and all that. After that, San Francisco was going to get bombed, but hopefully they were going to get everything out of there before then. But the whole thing was, by the time they were putting Camp Adair, or Adair Air Force Station in the early 60s, the Beaumark was obsolete. And the reason they were obsolete was because the whole world technology was advancing, and they were going from bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, Beaumark worked on planes, but they couldn't reach a missile, so they were useless. So it got scrapped. But before it got scrapped, just the same as building the Army camp, the contractors, they made as much money as they could. If you look at the old Army camp, you'll see that there's still chimneys standing around down there. Well, when they were tearing it down, my grandfather and an uncle, they brought their farm cats out there, and they were trying to help tear things down. Those chimneys are almost impossible to go down without blowing them up with dynamite, because the contractors, they got paid by time and material. And so they built the thickest walled chimneys that you could ever see, and they were extremely strong. Same thing there with the Beaumark missile camp. It was obsolete before they started, but they started and they just built as fast as they could to get as much money as they could before they got stopped. You go out there and you look, there is, I think, 18 slabs that the Beaumark missiles were set on. They didn't go down into a silo like the ballistic missiles. They sat on a cement slab, and there was a building over them that just kind of opened up like a clamshell, and then the missile was raised up on its hydraulic arm and then fired off. And you'll notice all the slabs run north to south because they were expecting bombers from the north. Anyway, it never got used. But the other stand of fir trees you'll see around there, if you go on through Camp Adair till you hit the Dallas Corvallis Highway, or Independence Corvallis Highway, and if you jog over and hit the road that cuts into North Albany, Spring Hill Road, you'll notice after you go down that hill a little ways, if you look back to your right, there's another stand of trees back there. That stand of trees is on the Jingles donation land claim. He became a politician. He was a county commissioner and I think a representative, I think, in the state. And he had been a postmaster over in the town of Liberty, which is Liberty Road coming out of Salem. But they started that thing up there when he was in there. And the first person buried there was a guy that died on the wagon train in Oregon City. The family continued on down there to the Willamette Valley, to this area, and they brought the body with him. And he was the first one buried there. And there's another one over there, I think his name is White, but I wouldn't swear to it. And he was a wagon master. And other names in there I recognize are Flickingers. They used to have a gas station store right next to us out there. And there's Suvers, which the town of Suver is named after. So there's a bunch of history there. Mm-hmm. And this place, that cemetery there, has grown up there, and people bought farmland all the way around, so there's no access to it. But some guy who's got a relative or so buried there, he worked out a deal there where he got to take it over and be responsible for it. And he worked out a deal there where he was able to bulldoze the road into it there now. So it is accessible now, but you have to get permission to go in there. But like I say, if you see a clump of trees standing up there, kind of a nice, usually square or rectangular, get suspicious. There's something old there, and there's a reason why there's old trees there that haven't been disturbed. Mm-hmm. And so that's my hint to somebody wanting to try and find history. That's one of the footprints to look for.
Yep. Well, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the blockhouse, because you mentioned the blockhouse. And if you've ever been to Camp Adair, there's a blockhouse, and it's probably 200 feet by 200 feet, and it's made out of cement. And I've heard that the walls are 6 to 8 feet thick. Supposedly, it can withstand any kind of a blast other than a nuclear blast. And it was built in the late 50s as part of an early warning system. It originally, 2 of the floors each had a computer. These were massive computers, with something like 60 or 70,000 vacuum tubes each. And they were connected to a variety of different sources to determine whether the Soviets were launching a first strike towards the Americans coming over the North Pole, and that's what the Bomark missiles were to defend against. Do you remember that building being built and anything about that period?
Oh, we were there at the time, but I don't really remember anything specific about being built. But it was a SAGE building, which is a strategic something to do with
ground environment are the last two.
Okay.
Air, ground environment.
Anyway, there were, I think Dennis is our expert on Air Force things, but I think he said there was 12 or something like that in the state or nation. We had places like Mount Hebo and picket ships out in the ocean and all these other little radar sites. They would all feed into places like Adair. And they had, like I say, those 2 big computers, and then a building out behind there, that was just air conditioning unit to keep everything cooled down. Because you imagine, back in those days, all those vacuum tubes, and somebody has told me that nowadays your cell phone has got more computing power than that whole building had.
Like thousands of times more computing than that building
but
had.
that was our line of thing. That was the first big computer, and IBM designed it and built it. And we've evolved considerably since then, which is the reason why SAGE and these places aren't being used anymore, because technology keeps advancing and advancing and advancing, and the old technology just gets abandoned and left. And it's leaving places for us historians and that to look at and discover and tell people about. So,
do you remember when Adair Village was formed?
It was built the same time the air base went in, which was there in the start of the 60s. I think 59 or something like that. Dennis could tell you, but when they first started something there. But actually it was from 60 to what, I don't think it went into the 70s, like maybe about 68 or something like
Yeah,
that.
68, 69, I think.
Yeah, when they went out of there. But they built the original housing project, which is to the north of the blockhouse. And that was for married couple and officers and stuff. And once the Air Force left out of there, those houses were sold to individuals, and they ended up forming their own little housing association, or whatever you want to call it. And they decided they wanted to be, it wasn't Adair
Meadows.
Adair Meadows. That was the idea they had. But the bureaucrats down there in the courthouse and all that, they went back to the old Adair Village name, which was the old actual Betts Village. So anyway, we've got the old name because of a mistake by a clerk somewhere. But anyway, they got that, and then they've expanded. They built more houses to the north of there, and now they've gone down there on the other side of Riles Lane and built a good-sized subdivision down there, and they're just growing by leaps and bounds. I think it's supposed to be the fastest growing town in the state right now. And with the original wastewater treatment plant from the Air Force, the original water treatment plant from the Army, which that was, I think, one of the biggest deals about why that the Air Force Base and all this housing is there, because the Army had, when they built the water intake over there by Albany, they had the tremendous water rights granted to them. And when they started going to private housing up there, one of the government guys that was handling the turnover there, he told them, do not let anybody else get those water rights away from you. That's a fortune. And they've kept it. So between wastewater treatment and water, they're kind of expanding not only right there on the footprint of their base, Air Force Base, but now they're starting to pick up some of the surrounding civilian deals around there, which is, income coming in for the city, plus improving the living conditions for the other people around here. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody there.
Yep. Well, kind of on the idea there of Adair Village and villages and towns and things like that. When Camp Adair was built, it's roughly 90 square miles. There were a number of small towns and villages that ceased to exist, school districts and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those things? As
I understand, there were 10 little country schools that were wiped out and eliminated. And one of them down there was in the town of Wells, which is in the middle of the E.E. Wilson. And that town, the schoolhouse down there, we have a record of that because there was a wonderful neighbor of ours who's passed there now, but she was active there in the Polk County Museum, and she kept track of all this stuff. But we have a picture of all the students there at the Wells School, and she's one of them. They're all standing out there taking a picture. When the government was deciding to build the base there, they had some government agents go out there, and they'd walk around the farmers there, and they'd come out there, the farmer out the field, and here, flip a silver dollar at him. If he caught it, he was accepting their little down payment on his property. There was a lot of hard feelings about all that.
Yeah, because we didn't really mention that. You've got all these farmers that have farmland there. The government came in and just took the farmland, gave them pennies on a dollar for the farmland.
And that's why those two books up there at the Polk County Museum, why there's so much bitterness in there, and that's why I'm pushing for the idea there that Adair Living History, that we do our own book and we collect the stories of, like I keep telling them every time I give a presentation there, okay, how many of you here are here because one of your ancestors was at Camp Adair or the Adair Air Force Station? and they fell in love with some local lass here, and if it wasn't for them, you wouldn't be here. So there are happy stories, and I want to start collecting those and do our own happy book about the history of Adair to help counteract the bad stories there from the other one. I mean, they're all essential. We need the good and the bad both, but I think it's time that we started promoting some of the good memories.
Camp Adair during World War II, I believe, is the title, and there's a volume 1 and a volume 2, and it's a lot of interviews with local people and newspaper articles and things like that that really talks about the history of Camp Adair during World War II. Now, I wanted to go back prior to that time period, and a story that you've told me about. Just west of where the camp currently exists, or where the E.E. Wilson currently exists, where the main encampment was, there was a town called Tampico. And this is an intriguing story. So would you mind sharing the story of Tampico with us,
Okay,
please?
Wells was eliminated, and also Tampico was eliminated. That was eliminated not because of the camp. It was eliminated way before that. But Wells is in Soap Creek Valley. And I recently, doing some of my research on trying to find stuff on Tampico, I found that there was a wonderful book on there. I think it's Oshkosh or something like that wasn't the name of it. But it's all about the history of Soap Creek Valley and Tampico. And there's a name that keeps popping up all the time, Greenberry Smith. And you see there's a Greenberry Engineering, and south of Corvallis there's a Greenberry store and tavern and all that. I'd heard stories that Greenberry Smith was mad at Tampico because he was a very strict religious guy. And so he bought the whole town out and burned it down. Well, after reading this book there, that story is not quite accurate, but like a lot of rumors and that, there's still a kernel of truth in there somewhere. And that kernel of truth seems to be that Greenberry, which, to straighten out one thing right now, everybody looks at it as one word. His first name was Green, his middle name was Berry, and his last name was Smith. It's all run together there right now. But anyway, he had money. And so he got himself his donation land claim out there. And then other people moving in, they were wanting to build houses, build stores, and all this sort of stuff. And they needed money, and Greenberry, he had money. So he loaned stuff there to people, and they built their stuff in that. And then somewhere in the future in that, times got tough, and they couldn't make their payment, much less the interest he was charging. So he ended up buying or receiving back the land and the buildings and stuff that were on it. And he didn't like what was going on down there, that's for sure, because back in the old days, I mean, when I was a kid, we made our own entertainment, and so they did that back in the old days too. But one of their entertainments was everybody had horses. So they laid out a racetrack down there, and there was racing and betting, and I think there was a saloon, and usually when there's saloons in Old Town, there's usually some ladies around that also entertained. But anyway, he didn't like all this sort of stuff. But anyway, I guess once he owned the whole town, he tore it down. He probably just burned it up, building by building as he cleared it off. But he didn't go through and burn the whole town down as I was originally understanding the whole idea. But the thing that would have old Greenberry turning over in his grave, he also, south of Corvallis, he owned a piece of land 1 mile wide and 8 miles long. And if you go south of there, you'll find, I think it's Willamette Grange, and then there's the Greenberry store and tavern. So there is a tavern on his land, and that has got to have him spinning in his grave. But he's very definitely a big part of our history. Now, one of the things about Soap Creek out there, I believe it was like 1920 or so, the legislature in Oregon got rid of, I think they called it, black exclusion laws or something like that. And that's what most people don't know that's around here, is that Oregon was segregated back in the old days, to a certain extent anyway. It's like, you're welcome here, but don't be here when the sun goes down type thing. But anyway, in Soap Creek, one guy moved in there, and he bought a property there and built a house. He came from Kentucky, and he had a common law wife. And according to that book I got there on the Soap Creek Valley, his wife had been his slave. So I'm assuming from Kentucky enslaved that she was colored. Okay, it's something that they had a law that when a person got deeded land and all that sort of stuff, that their wife could also buy the same amount of acreage that the husband did. So because of that, according to this book, the marrying age for women got down to about 13, 14 years old. Anyway, this one guy there, his wife, which we were assuming it was colored, she ended up owning land. And so this was something there that should have been completely against all the segregationist laws there was in that day. But it's amazing when you get digging around finding history, all these interesting things you can find. Another thing there that concerned a black person, I think he was from Georgia or someplace like down there. There was this black guy that was out there running around, and World War II came along, and they were recruiting people to go into the service. Well, I guess this guy didn't have a lot of friends, or he had an enemy anyway. Anyway, this guy sicked the old government agents onto him, and they captured him and enlisted him into the army. Okay, he was a blues singer. He went by the name of Howlin' Wolf. And in the wisdom of the army, they took this illiterate guy, couldn't read or write, and he put him into the Signal Corps. And so this was up there at Fort Lewis, if I remember right. And of course, being in the Signal Corps, he couldn't write stuff or read stuff and all that, which was, that's all there was, communication, So instead of saying they're wrong and putting him into some place that he could handle, they assigned a drill sergeant to him to teach him to read and write. Any of you who have had a drill sergeant know that they're going to get results no matter what you think. And he ended up having a nervous breakdown, and he ended up in the Army hospital there at Camp Adair. So there was a person gets into the history of this stuff, and I think people that are looking for research projects and that for high school, college, and all that, and especially if you're talking about segregation and all this sort of stuff, research what the heck went on around here locally. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was normal for the time. Nowadays, looking back on it, it was bad, but you cannot judge people as being bad because that was the norm at that time. They weren't being bad according to the rules and regulations and stuff that we lived in at that time. But it is. I've gotten on this little bit of history, and I'm not educated and all that, but I've been finding. I just get fascinated with all these oddball things that we keep finding. Mm-hmm. So many people, like our Matt, he is the expert on the Army. His grandfather was trained there at Adair, Camp Adair, and so he's very much into that. And Dennis is Air Force.
Matt Helgett, who is a board member also of Adair Living History.
Right, and then we've got another board member there, Mary Jamison, mm-hmm. and her father was a timber wolf that went through Camp Adair too. So we've got families and all that. My only family that was in World War II was one of my mother's brothers, mm-hmm. and he was with Patton over there in the Battle of the Bulge. He was a radio operator in a half-track, and he, like so many of the people from that era and even later wars, so many veterans, when they come home, they don't talk to their family about what they went through. They might talk to other vets, but they don't talk to their family. He just tried to bury it. Well, my mother, after she died, my wife and I, we were going through her old country store over there. And I always say that my mother never met a flat surface that she didn't like. She was constantly writing stories and poems and old candy cardboard boxes and stuff, the walls, anything. When the urge came to write, she was writing. And she never got around to using the computer or anything like that. So she made copies, everything was all in longhand, her originals, her copies and everything. But anyway, my wife found back there in all the old records for the store, she found, I don't remember which candy bar it was, but it was a candy bar box, and it had all these 5x7 index cards in it. And she had recorded on there all the letters that she had wrote to my brother in the Army, and all the letters that he sent back to her and to his parents and all that. So she had all this back and forth going on there while he was there in World War II. Of course, he couldn't say where he was at all these different times and all that, but it did give a good basis of what one guy's thoughts were. And so when she found that, before that, we'd found a letter that she had written to an aunt up there in Paulsboro, Washington, and she was saying that she had all this stuff and she was going to write this book about her brother Dick and his war experiences. Well, we knew she'd never made a book, and when my wife found that, here was the whole story laid out there, and so I typed the whole thing up on my computer. Minus, she had all these little deals in there where she was going to put all these different sketches and illustrations in there. She was a pretty crafty gal there, so I didn't put all the sketches and stuff in there. But we did the story. Now I went into the local copy outfit and made up 10 copies of it, and I gave copies to everybody in the family. And I gave Uncle Dick, he had 2 daughters, so I sent 3 copies down there, one for him and then Ruth Mary, and one for each of the daughters. And Ruth Mary, she wrote back and thanked me about it because he was dying. I don't remember what it was there now. I think it was palsy or something, but it was something that took quite a while anyway. She said as he was getting towards the end there, laying in the bed, she would sit there or lay on the bed beside him and read from that book his letters and the family's letters back and forth. And because of what my mom did and what I finished up for her, his daughters know what their father was like, really what he went through.
Yep.
And so we can preserve history individually or as a group, but it all needs to be saved.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so Gary, one of the things that you've been working on and you've turned over to me is to collect photos of Camp Adair from that time period going back to before the camp was even developed, and then also up pretty much to the current time almost. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in having these photos and bringing them together and putting them in one place?
Well, this searching for history over there, so much of it as you search for it on the internet, it comes up as photos. And so, okay, I'd save off those photos and pirating them. A lot of other things too that probably didn't have copyrights on. But anyway, I started doing those and putting those in there with all this information. And then, of course, on some of the stuff there, I've taken some photos myself. And we just, as we give these PowerPoints, I use all those photos, and then if it's from a collection from like Benton County Museum or something like that, when we do the PowerPoint on there, I'll put the photo in the center of the slide, and up on the top I'll put the identification number of it, and on the left side over there would be what collection it'd be from, what museum, and all that sort of stuff, the photographer if known, and the important thing there that we're trying to do there now is the date, or as close as we can to the date that it's done. Because what this has evolved into here at the last is what I call a pictorial chronograph, which is taking all these pictures and putting them into chronographical order to show the history in pictures. And it's not necessarily, this one, like the blockhouse here, but if different photos in there at the different times, so a person can start looking through these. And right now, as you know, we're into our second photo album already, and we're making these. We're doing it on PowerPoint, so we can modify and edit that as we need to. Anyway, we print off the photo on there, put it into one of these clear plastic sleeves, and then put it into this album. So as we get new information as we go along, we can find the appropriate place and put it in there. So we'll try to keep everything in the order we can. Some places or some things we don't know the exact dates, so on those we just, we know it has to be within this time span. We just kind of stick it in there somewhere. But we're trying to save not just Camp Adair and Adair Air Force Station, but pictures of the land that this is sitting on. What went before that? Right now, the oldest one who got in there is, I think it's 1917, I think it is. My grandfather's photos of the Wells railroad station down there. And we're trying to get more photos from other people and add them into it. And as you know, Benton County Museum, they've got a lot more photos that we need to get
Right.
All indexed and into there, which I'm leaving that to you. Thank you.
I'll do my
Anyway,
best.
I don't think that we should eliminate or limit it to Camp Adair and Adair Air Force. I want to go back as far as we can, because we've got Calapooya Indians. They lived in this area.
Right.
And with the people here now, I want to come clear up to the modern day, and as new buildings and that get put up there in Adair Village, put them in there too, so people can look through there and, okay, this is when this building was put in, and a little bit of history and all that. Because Benton County, not only have they turned the Officers Club into a venue to rent out, but the old town of Palestine, their cemetery up there, they were kind of limited. They couldn't expand, and so they wanted to be able to sell more plots. So they moved the old church from there, or they wanted to get rid of the old church. Benton County took it and moved it over there, and it's on the plot there now. And they're going to get that all fixed up to make another venue for them out there. Camp Adair and Adair Village is, as it goes along, and they keep expanding on houses and start building a little bit of a city center, business district, and have this wonderful park down there and all these venues that they can do too. And they've got the golf frisbee, they've got the radio controlled aerodrome. This is going to end up being quite an attractive spot for visitors. And of course, getting them out there, getting visitors out there, we can introduce them to the history.
Right.
And people that come there for the history, they can be introduced to the recreational part of this. So I just everybody feeds off of it, and everybody profits from it.
Yep.
I think this, like I say, that this photo albums there, I hope to see, or I won't live to see it, but as you and your descendants look at it, I hope to see a whole shelf up there of all these albums that are just showing more and more and more history of this whole area. I think it's an original idea.
I think it's a great idea. Now, there's a series of photos that you have collected that are part of our collection that are very interesting. It was from sometime in the early 60s, there was an emergency drill. And when they dress these people for this emergency drill, they've got cuts on them, they've got broken bones. They look pretty gory. Why don't you tell us about how you happened to be in a position to be able to take these photos and see this particular emergency drill?
I don't remember if I was still in high school or if I was out, but it'd be around that area there somewhere. My folks had this rental house, and there was an Air Force sergeant and his family living there, and he was in the Air Police. And he told me that they'd come up with this civil defense drill that they were going to have down there. If I wanted to come down, take a look at it, come on. Okay, so I grabbed my little 35 millimeter slide camera, and I went down there, and I got some of the goriest photos, all fake, but you can't hardly tell. And I've shown these photos to current first responders, and they say, why don't we have all of our drills like this, you know? What they had done, they took a bunch of airmen. Okay, we're going to take you out to the firing range out there. You got to get qualified on your pistol or whatever it is, that the weapon that they were supposed to be qualified on. So I loaded them up in the bus, and they took off, and they went down there and drove into some building somewhere on the camp, or a Air Force base. And they got in there and shut the doors on them, unloaded the guys, stripped them down, gave them old ripped up and used uniforms that were ripped up and burned and everything. And they put those on them, and then they had all these rubber wounds, I mean bones sticking out, big gash cuts and all that. They stuck these things onto them, and then they took all this fake blood and poured all over them, and they took them back on the bus, and they drove over to the Air Base service station. They got all these guys unloaded out there, and they spread them all out all over the ground out there, went around, poured all that fake blood all over them. And they set off a bunch of smoke pots all over the place, and then turned in the alarm. The fire department, none of those people knew about it. Mm-hmm. And so they were judging it. They had county and of course the Air Force, all that, civil defense and all that. They were all out there doing things, and they're out there with my little cameras snapping pictures and making all these slides and everything. And here it is, all this smoke running through here, and here's a body laying there, you know, with a bone sticking out of his leg and all this blood and everything. And it was the most wonderful drill I've ever seen. Of course, that's the only one I've ever seen. But like I say, when I show it to these other first responders, they say, we go out there something like that now, and then there's a tag on there, I have a broken bone. What in the heck kind of drill is that? Well, what's that teaching them? They're not learning triage or anything. Mm-hmm. But this, I think, whether it's they figure they're going to offend somebody or what, but that was to me, my idea of the perfect civil defense drill. And I wish that more people would see it and incorporate it. I think it'd make much better first responders out of people.
Well, the pictures are definitely interesting.
Interesting, yes.
Well, do you have anything else you'd like to add, Gary?
Oh, I wish you would ask me that when I was younger and I could still remember things. I think the main thing is I'm sure thanking the Lord that you've come to take over for me and to continue this and to improve it and put a polish on it.
Well, thank you. I'll do my best.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gary. It's been a pleasure interviewing you today. Today is December 19th, 2023. And Gary and I are both board members on Adair Living History, and our goal is to keep the history of this area alive. And as you can tell, Gary has a real passion and really wants to keep that history alive, and I feel the same way, as do other members of the board. If you'd like to learn more about Adair Living History, we have a website, adairhistory.org. And also Gary has a website or a Facebook page that he hosts that has information on Adair history.
Yeah, that's I remember Camp Adair and Adair Air Force Base on Facebook. And if you get on there, we have an author there that on World War II history romances. It's extremely accurate. She researches for a year to make sure everything's right. But she puts a daily blog on there. This day, 75 years ago, 80 years ago, is there in the World War II era, and she comes up with photographs and information that nobody else knows about. It's just stuff she's collected over the years and writing her books.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much. Remember, adairhistory.org.